How may I address you?
Susan's fine.
Susan, thanks so much for joining me. I do appreciate it. It's a Friday afternoon. And as I said earlier, before I hit record, being a counsellor, being in public service is not for the faint-hearted. So I sincerely appreciate your time. What is your role?
So I'm the leader of Glasgow City Council, which is the equivalent of the mayor, but we don't have mayors in Scotland. So I'm elected by my constituents in my own ward, and I lead the minority administration. We have a proportional representation system here in Scotland, so we're all either minorities or coalitions, and we have a working agreement with the another party in the council, yes, so I'm the leader of the administration.
Right. The reason why I'm speaking to you as a city leader is cities are, as you well know, profoundly important in the future of humanity. And what I mean by that is cities only cover 2% of the Earth's land surface, but the vast majority of us live there. The vast majority of knowledge is created there. The vast majority, as of course you well know, of emissions are emitted in cities. So if you can shape the course of a city, you can help to shape the course positively for the future. So this conversation is essentially about three things. It's about cities, secondly, leadership and your journey of leadership. It's also about what you might mean by a better future as shaped by the SDGs. And that's, of course, where the net zero or circular economy, rather, conversation comes in. And finally, of particular interest is trust. And what I mean by trust, it's in the technical sense, it's interpersonal, organizational, and societal trust. And you may not use the word trust, but as a leader in your city, I can pretty much bet that a great deal of your work has to do with building trust with your own constituents and, to use political language, people on both sides of the aisles. Maybe you've got more sides to the aisle in Glasgow, I'm not sure. So I'd love to talk about trust as well. Let's start with leadership. Your bio is easy and quick to read, fairly quick to read, and it's all very neatly laid out. But what is the journey towards those multiple leadership positions you've had in public service? Why public service in the first place?
And so I grew up in a family that was very strongly oriented towards public service, not elected politics, but working in public service, but also volunteering, very political. And party political, but not. I'm the first person in my family to have been elected to office. Well, no, that's not true. Actually, I had a great uncle who was a councillor in Ayrshire in Glasgow, which is close to Glasgow, for a long time. So that's complete rubbish I just said. But my immediate family, I suppose. But I do come from actually. Generations of activists, committed activists on the left of politics in Scotland, and great internationalists as well. So in some ways it came naturally to me. I did not intend to go into elected office myself, though, and in fact I was 40 before I ever stood for election for the first time, and it was more because I was a very strong campaigner within my own party, the Scottish National Party, for quotas for gender balance in elections, particularly at local government level, actually, but at all levels of governance. And eventually somebody said to me that I really should start putting my money where my mouth was and and step up. So I stood for local government elections in Glasgow back in 2012, and then through a process ended up first of all being the leader of my group when we were still in opposition, and then winning the election, and then being re-elected, in fact, just in May this year. So although I have a very strong public service ethos, I suppose, was instilled in me from an early age, and professionally a strong public policy focus. I'm a policy wonk. The elected side of things wasn't necessarily a natural choice for me, but I turned out to be not bad at it. So
let me put you in a bit of a box, okay? Not knowing you, but this is the box I'm going to put you in, and you've helped to paint it a little bit a few moments ago. You used the word activist. You come from a long line of activists, okay? So that's one color I'm painting your box with. The other color I'm painting your box with is that you serve in the city setting, so you have very little time to do anything else other than get the job done, okay? So I can imagine you're very practically minded, and that's one thing that city leaders are revered for,
Very
is
much.
getting stuff done. But having said that, let's just go to theory just for a moment, as much as it might offend you. When you reflect on the practice of leadership, what has informed that? What has informed your leadership practice and the act of doing leadership?
So I think, yes, I do sometimes try and pause to reflect on this, because, as you know, as I say, the whole thing of becoming a leader happened all quite quickly for me. I think being a woman actually has been quite a significant part of it, and thinking about being a woman in leadership, still relatively rare in local government and in cities in Scotland. And in actual fact, we have the Scottish Cities Alliance of Scotland, 7 cities, and there's just been an 8th one just appointed as for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. And there were a couple of other women leaders before the election, but I'm now the only women leader of a city in Scotland. I think I've always felt a certain responsibility to reflect my personal politics and personal values in the way that I present myself publicly, in the way that I lead. You know, I said that I was a campaigner within my own party for you know, better representation of women in elected office. And so when I became a woman in elected office, and particularly a leader, I think, right, okay, I had to think about, what does that mean then? How do I now use this position that I've got? How do I, you know, how do I define myself as a leader? So you know, I think I found that very challenging, and I think a lot of women find it very challenging, and particularly because it is unusual. I didn't have a lot of role models, if you like, in terms of city leadership. That's not just in Scotland, that's in the UK as well. I've been very lucky since I've been in this job to meet amazing women city leaders. Anne Hidalgo in Paris, for example, Mayor Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, the mayor of Freetown, is, you know, incredible women. So as time has gone on, I have been able to get role models, but I had to become a leader before I could get them, if you see what I mean. They weren't there for me to begin with. Yeah. So I think that part has been very important for me. I think, you know, trying to find the right balance between collaboration and delegation, which I do a lot of, and I think, you know, my colleagues in the sort of the city government that I lead would say that I am, you know, I put a lot of trust in them, in their skills to deliver, their abilities, they're a superb team, but then recognizing that when you've got the title of leader, when, you know, the chips are down and when it's tough, somebody has to make a decision, and you can't shirk that responsibility and pass it off on to others. Ultimately, you have to have that that kind of courage, I suppose, and that can be challenging sometimes, when you have to reach within yourself, but recognize that, yeah, courage is a big part of it. So, you know, I think and looking outwards as well, I think always trying to not talk to my own interests or concerns, but constantly be trying to address the concerns of the citizens that I serve, and thinking about how I, you know, frame the conversations that I have with them to make them meaningful, to be outward looking. I don't mean self-serving in the sense of you know, in the sense of helping yourself, but more, it can be very easy sometimes to get caught up in your own particular interests, I suppose, particularly when you are a political animal. There's certain things that you want to achieve, certain kind of you know, outcomes that you want to see. But sometimes you have to, if not set them aside, because I do think you try and remain your authentic self as a leader, as much as possible, but recognize that you're not leading for yourself and your own interests, your own hobbies, if you like. You're leading on behalf of others, and you have to try and have as broad a view as possible in that respect, but also be willing to say no, be willing to say to people, you know, for example, Glasgow is a home to a lot of refugees and asylum seekers. We're in fact the biggest asylum dispersal city in the UK, and not everyone likes that. There are some people who don't like that. Now, that's not an interest that I'm there to serve. You know, I'm not going to at any point say, oh well, we'll not accept any more refugees then, because I believe that it's one of my core values, and actually I think it's a core value of the city. But what I do have to do, I can't say, well, I'm not engaging with those people because I disagree with them. What I have to do is say, okay, why do those people feel like that? Is it fear? Is it concern that they will lose something? How do we address that? How do we try to make, you know, and it's not a case of trying to win them over necessarily, but recognizing that these people are still going to have needs that have to be served. And I am still, you know, they almost certainly didn't vote for me, but nonetheless, I'm elected to lead for them and on their behalf, as much as the people who might share my personal and political values. You know, I think an example I would pick on just now is traffic and cars. And we have Glasgow's a very historically very car-dominated city, which is particularly problematic because we actually have very low car ownership in the city. It's often people from outside, but the way our city centre in particular is designed has made it very car-dominated for, you know, almost a century. And we have policies to change that and to massively something else to design that out of the way the city functions. And a lot of people are very, very unhappy about that. They're very threatened by that. And, you know, I can't just say tough. You know, we need to recognise and try to address those worries, those concerns, that anger, because it does cause anger, without compromising on the policies that we know we need to enact, and because the outcomes that we'll achieve are essential to the future well-being of the city. So there's so many balancing acts, and I think recognizing all of those, but as I say, trying to remain your authentic self within that, because I think people understand they're not going to agree with you on everything, but I think especially Glaswegians, people in Glasgow don't, you know, they can spot what we would say a chancer a mile off, and
the rest of the world, you don't have to explain that to me, Susan. The rest of the world gets it.
That I think they find much more offensive than you simply not agreeing with them, or you know that. Yeah. So yeah, sorry that I'm not sure that was a very clear or articulate answer. I think I'm probably thinking it through. I'm thinking aloud rather than actually giving you a clear answer. But yeah.
No,
so,
well, my takeaways are this. You know, there was a moment in which you needed to reflect on what it meant to not only be a leader, but a leader as a woman, in light of the fact that there weren't many role models around. But indeed, there's no lack of role models, which you found and mentioned, one of whom the wonderful mayor of Freetown I'll be speaking to in a few weeks' time. So that was the first point. The second is showing courage, and showing courage, especially when the world doesn't really seem to be on your side, but you're doing the right thing, which speaks to integrity. The third thing you mentioned is, well, I'm thinking about, you didn't use this language in particular, but your constituents, others, the greater community, which is benevolence. And finally, you've mentioned now authenticity as well. So thank you for thinking out loud is what I'm trying to say. And how do you know OECD?
We've done some work together on, particularly around the work that we're doing in Glasgow in the circular economy, and turning Glasgow into a circular city, which is a very important strand, but one of the strands of work in progressing our ambition to become a zero carbon city by 2030, which is very ambitious, particularly for a post-industrial city like Glasgow. We still live with the legacies of our very high carbon past as a city, legacies which range from very large amount of vacant and derelict post-industrial land through to high levels of chronic ill health, particularly among people from more deprived backgrounds, and high levels of premature mortality as well, and in particular generational unemployment in some parts of the city as a consequence of the deindustrialization process. So although we know that it's a big ask to be zero carbon by 2030, we also see it as an enormous opportunity. Glasgow's transition from its industrial era was not a just one, and we live with the legacies of that unjust transition. So we see the opportunity to be, I suppose, a world leader in effecting a just transition to our low carbon future, a low carbon economy and society in the future, as something that gives us the chance to redress some of the wrongs that were done to Glasgow citizens in the past. And of course, a big part of that is that we have to design out of our economy waste as much as possible, design out of the way that we do business in the city. So our circular economy route map is a big part of our wider route map to net zero. And the OECD have been a great support and guide in helping us to shape that and helping us to understand how a city like Glasgow goes about doing this. And of course, most importantly, how we work with businesses. And in actual fact, the circular economy work in Glasgow is business led. Our Chamber of Commerce, who are a very good partner to us in the City Council, have enthusiastically taken a lead in this work. But obviously we need a policy framework around that that comes from the democratic process. So in the council, we do work together very closely on that.
Mm.
And as I say, the OECD have been instrumental, I think, in helping us to frame our thinking about how we go about doing that.
How does a circular economy relate to net zero? Is one a subcomponent of the other, or are they two frameworks that are intermeshed?
I think net zero is predicated on a circular economy, at least in part. But I also think that a circular economy, it does function as its kind of own outcome and its own desired achievement, because it does more than just the climate side of things. It also responds to the human impact of an economy that is focused on very high levels of wasteful consumption and wasteful creation as well. Is an economy that doesn't actually work for fairness, for equality within communities and within society. So you have that, everything that underpins everything that we do in Glasgow, that my administration does, what the council does, is ultimately about tackling inequality, and it's about improving lives and life chances and outcomes for the poorest people in society. And so we have to fundamentally change the way that we do economic development in the city. Now, it's not in our gift to change national or global economies, but we can make changes within the city. And I think, you know, you can often, I think actually if there's something that the pandemic taught us, is that cities in particular can deliver change, and often very fundamental change, actually much faster and much more effectively than we thought we could.
Mm.
You know, it turns out actually you can pivot overnight, in because we were forced to when we went into lockdown. You can pivot overnight to doing things differently, if you have to. So that was a public health emergency. If we treat you know, the climate emergency, we talk about climate emergency, don't always behave as if it's an emergency. But if we treat the climate as an emergency, if we treat poverty as an emergency, and in actual fact, in fact, we just had a debate about this in council yesterday, the cost of living crisis, which we're, you know, many societies across the globe are facing, but is particularly acute in the UK for a number of factors. Inflation rates in the UK right now are at their highest level in 40 years, and the impact that that's having on households is devastating. So, you know, we have embedded long-term generational poverty in many parts of Glasgow. We haven't treated it as an emergency. We should have been for 40 years. But it is an emergency now. It's right in front of us. So we need to change. We need to behave the way that we did in the pandemic and pivot overnight. Yeah. And I think thinking about a circular economy, thinking about circular practices is a huge tool for us in underpinning. So, you know, we need to act on two fronts. We need to act to the immediate emergency in front of us, but we can't take our eye off the ball on the longer term shift. Otherwise, we'll just have more emergencies.
Can you mention just 3 leverage points that you are addressing in your city to accelerate progress towards a circular economy? Just a quick mention of 3 leverage points.
So renewable energy is one. We are very actively just now investigating heat networks for domestic properties and commercial properties as well. But I think our priority is domestic properties. We are working to create net zero manufacturing, and looking at some of the so textiles and fashion, for example, famously one of the most wasteful industries on the planet. We're actually working with the UK Fashion and Textiles Council to look at how we could create net zero textiles and fashion manufacturing in the city of Glasgow. And we are working very closely. Glasgow's economy, more than other cities, but disproportionately is based on small and medium enterprises rather than big corporates. We have a very large proportion of SMEs. And I think the whole idea of circularity and sustainability is often very challenging for them, because smaller businesses are sometimes living much more day to day. So we've got a real focus on pivoting our business support that we do as a council towards supporting sustainability and circularity within our SME sector. So those are the 3. Those are 3 areas. There are others I could go into, but those are the first 3 that come to mind.
To the notion of trust, when I say trust to you, what is trust? What is your definition of trust? And if that isn't something you've reflected on, what comes to mind off the cuff? Trust, what is it?
So I think it's a relationship where there's space for disagreement. There's space for sometimes maybe very robust disagreement. There's space for people to make mistakes. There's space for people to experiment and to challenge. But you know, and the understanding, but with an understanding underpinning that, that there is, I suppose, a common project that people are working towards, or a common aim. And I think that it's something that we've worked on. We've worked on very hard in Glasgow. In some respects, we're a divided quite a divided community, which is not unusual in cities particularly. But there is a sense, Glasgow actually just a few years ago, that it was the European Commission, I think, had named Glasgow as being a city where there were very high levels of trust and authenticity. In fact, I think was something that they talked about as well. And the sense that we are, you know, I suppose, a city that knows who we are, and there is that sense of perhaps a common civic purpose within the city. Now, I wouldn't say that we necessarily have that always, or as much as we would like. We do in very key respects, but I think for me that's what you would want to work towards in relationships with different groups. You know, we have. I mean, just to give one example, I suppose. And it's actually a very practical example that we experienced in Glasgow. When we came into administration, my party came into administration in the city. It was the first change of political administration in the city for 40 years. And we inherited homelessness services that were in very poor condition, and in actual fact had been censured by the Scottish housing regulator. The council in its performance was regularly breaching statutory standards in terms of the service that were providing to homeless people and the support that we were providing. So we knew that something radical had to happen. But as a result of that history, the third sector organisations, the voluntary sector, we call it the third sector in Scotland, who work in the homelessness sector and who worked with homeless people, there was a really, really poor relationship between them and the council. They were regularly, you know, taking the council to judicial review, for example, over failures in performance. It was not good at all. So we kind of pressed the reset button with them and said, right, we recognise, we put our hands up. We're not going to keep defending this. It is indefensible. And I think that was a very important thing to begin with, because I think there had been attempts to, if not defend, then certainly excuse the bad performance. So we were like, no, there isn't an excuse and we can't defend it. There are reasons. So we need to talk about the reasons and work through the reasons together. Now, it took us a while, and it you know, it has taken us I would say a good 3 or 4 years really to turn the service around. But what we've done is created something. We said, you know, we have to do this together, and we've created something called the Glasgow Alliance to End Homelessness, which is the council as part of what we call the Health and Social Care Partnership with the National Health Service in the city, and these third sector organisations, many of which were involved in direct support for people on the street, you know, providing everything from providing sleeping bags to someone who was sleeping rough to providing legal advice. So we formed this alliance, and it's a new model. We've never done it before, and it has been a huge success, I have to say. You know, we haven't solved all of the problems, far from it, but we have almost eradicated rough sleeping in the city. It's, you know, we have a small number of kind of persistent rough sleepers, if you like, who are actually by choice to a significant degree, but they are in the single figures now, having been around about the 60 mark regularly. We had would be the kind of average number of rough sleepers on any given night in the city, which is actually pretty low for a city of Glasgow's size. But we have quite a compact city centre, so it was very visible. So really have turned that around. In order to do that, we had to turn the relationships around, and there had to be a lot of honesty. There had to be a lot of quite a bit of soul searching, and we also had to agree collectively to kind of set the past aside, say, right, we know that things were bad in the past. Things have probably been said by everybody on all sides that shouldn't have been said, but we can't hold grudges. If we're going to turn this around and we're going to improve it, we need to come together and recognise that actually we all want the same outcome. We all want the same common cause. So it was, as I say, it was a very challenging process, and I think there were probably quite a few tears and huffs and storming us out along the way, but we got there, and you know, that kind of persistence in just constantly coming back and saying we need to get a better outcome, so we can't give up, we can't walk away from it, because actually this is not for us, it's not for our organisations, it's for the people that we collectively serve, and fighting over who's doing it better, or pots of money as well, it isn't going to help them. So we also, the money all goes into a single pot now, and you know, the alliance allocates and spends rather than individual organisation. If we can hold on to recognising that we want the same thing, then that is a starting point for building trust, and hopefully then that trust in itself builds the results and delivers the results that you want.
Briefly to reflect back to you, what I've taken away is, well, firstly, you've actually started on a good wicket. Excuse me if Glaswegians don't use that term, but in that Glasgow is known for a sense of self, which is not a bad place to start because there's honesty in the room. The trust, the levels of trust that where they have existed, it's allowed space for disagreement. You've also, as a council, and perhaps the whole community, has exercised transparency, taken responsibility, been very forward-looking, and you use the word soul-searching. There's been some soul-searching. You've also said, to use your words, there've been tears, and there's been some huffs, so, yeah, and some walking out, which is there's vulnerability there, and there's frustration there, and there's anger there, and there's all that stuff that comes with public show of emotion. It's all there, which doesn't happen in every environment. And you've also let the past go for the sake of looking ahead as well. And so I would call that forgiveness. You know, you've let things go, which is remarkable. Now, in the last 60 seconds we've got, leading cities is it's a complex thing. There are similarities throughout the world, I'm sure. What would your top three, forgive the triteness of this, what would your top three leadership takeaways be for people in your position, leading cities, complex cities?
Yeah, I should have thought about this in advance. I think it was interesting. I didn't grow up in a city. I grew up in a rural area, but I was one of those kids who spent my entire time counting down the days until I could move away to the city. Yeah. So in my heart, I love cities. I love cities and everything about them. And first and foremost, that's the thing to hold on to.